Olá, boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a todas. Estamos aqui na nossa retomada do primeiro dia de atividades do Encontro do Corruptione, nossa jornada de estudo sobre a história da corrupção, voltada preferencialmente para a história medieval. Nós teremos agora a realização da nossa conferência de abertura do encontro, que será realizada pelo professor Ronald Kroeze, da Universidade Livre de Amsterdã, na Holanda, né? Esse é um convite muito importante para todos nós, tem um significado muito marcante para o grupo, porque ele é a concretização de um propósito genuinamente intelectual. Ao longo do último ano, desde a fundação do grupo do Corruptione, nós estivemos à volta com esforços coletivos de debates e discussões, grupos de estudo, perpassamos algumas leituras, algumas obras, mas aquela que mais nos marcou foi a leitura de um livro intitulado The Anti-Corruption in History, From Antiquity to Modern Era, a anticorrupção na história da antiguidade até o período moderno, organizado pelo professor Ronald, e foi uma leitura muito marcante para todos nós. É um livro com um escopo valiosíssimo para todos aqueles que se interessam sobre o tema. Eu me arriscaria a dizer, né, Filó, que é um livro que nos leva a nos confrontarmos com as principais questões envolvendo o estudo histórico da história da corrupção, e desde um primeiro momento, quando nós começamos a discutir a possibilidade dessa realização do evento, desse nosso primeiro encontro, nós não poderíamos ter pensado num outro nome, o mais significativo, talvez não apenas num certo plano historiográfico, mas talvez até mesmo tanto quanto identitário para o nosso grupo, que não fosse o de fazer o convite ao professor Ronald, o organizador do livro, também com um belo capítulo sobre a história da Holanda nesse mesmo livro. E ele prontamente, muito gentilmente, aceitou participar, realizar essa conferência de abertura, nos brindando aqui com uma perspectiva de avaliação, um apanhado e uma avaliação sobre o estado da arte envolvendo a história da corrupção. Acho que, para uma breve introdução, é isso, né, Filó?
Eu vou passar agora, brevemente, a tentar fazer um resumo aqui do currículo do professor Ronald Kroeze. Ele é professor associado de História Política e diretor de estudos na Vrije Universiteit de Amsterdã. Ele doutorou-se em 2013 com uma tese que é o resultado de um trabalho de pesquisa sobre corrupção e moralidade pública na política holandesa, como parte de um projeto maior, intitulado A Gênese do Sistema de Valores Públicos, 1650-1950, promovido pela Organização dos Países Baixos para a Pesquisa Científica, a NWO. Os resultados foram publicados em um livro em 2013, com o título Uma Questão de Moralidade Política, Escândalos de Corrupção Política e Bom Governo nos Países Baixos, 1848-1940. Ele é fundador e coordenador do projeto de pesquisa Normatividade Colonial, Corrupção e Diferença nas Histórias Coloniais e Pós-Coloniais do Império e das Nações, iniciado em 2019 e patrocinado também pela NWO. Este projeto internacional compara o papel da corrupção nas histórias de formação da nação entre a Holanda e a Indonésia. Em 2018, juntamente com Inger Leemans e Joost Dankers, o professor Kroeze recebeu um financiamento da NWO para a criação de uma rede de trabalho para desenvolver uma pesquisa sobre história financeira e patrimônio. Ele é ainda cofundador da Rede Internacional Política e Corrupção, fundada pelo CNRS da França, e foi professor visitante nas universidades de Oxford, Warwick, Avignon, Humboldt, em Berlim. Para o nosso grupo de pesquisa, o Corruptione, uma de suas publicações-chave, como o professor Leandro já referiu, é o livro Uma História da Anticorrupção da Antiguidade à Era Moderna, organizado por ele e por Guy Geltner e André Vitória, publicado pela Oxford University Press em 2018. Os resultados das pesquisas do professor Kroeze têm aparecido em vários livros e em conhecidos periódicos científicos internacionais e têm propiciado a orientação de pesquisas de pós-graduação sobre o tema da corrupção. Na Vrije Universiteit, o professor Kroeze ministra cursos sobre história da democracia, corrupção e Europa moderna, bem como filosofia política e justiça global. Ele ainda oferece o curso Democracia na História Moderna na Amsterdam University College. O currículo do professor Kroeze é muito extenso, sobretudo com ricas experiências de pesquisa sobre o tema que interessa de perto aqui ao nosso encontro. Certamente estamos todos desejosos de ouvi-lo. Professor Ronald Kroeze, once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And now I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you also for the invitation as well, and for the kind introduction. My Portuguese is not fluent, but I could follow some of the things that you mentioned that I've been working on. I will now try to share my slide. The slide is already there. Okay. So then I will start. And here is the evening in Antwerp. So I live in Antwerp in Belgium, and in close to the Netherlands. Here is evening, so good evening, but for you is good afternoon, or the beginning of the afternoon, actually. I will be talking about some of the latest developments. So the title is Understanding the History of Corruption, Some Reflections on the Latest Developments in the Field. In the last decades, corruption has received, just move on to the next slide. Yeah. In the last decades, corruption has received new public and scholarly attention. I will reflect on, in my view, some of the latest and most important developments in the field. First, the rise of what has been called the new corruption histories and how it is linked to political history. Next, the long-term perspective that is becoming more dominant now. Third, I will talk about othering and the link between new corruption histories, colonial and global history. Fourth, modern corruption. What do we mean with modern corruption? 5, the emergence of anti-corruption as a distinctive theme. And 6, the historic turn. And finally, some concluding remarks. And when we have some time left, I can take a few questions. This talk is based on my experiences as a researcher of the history of corruption for over the last 15 years. Been involved in different projects, was already been mentioned, some of them. One was a project taking a long-term perspective on Dutch history, focusing on public values and corruption, so the genesis of public values. Another project relevant for this talk is the EU-funded Anti-Corp project. It was funded by the European Union. It consisted of several work packages, and one of the work packages, one of the projects was on the history of anti-corruption. Other projects were, for example, on more recent or legal perspectives on corruption and anti-corruption, but this was the historical perspective. And the most important result was the book Anti-Corruption in History, which was also briefly introduced earlier. And currently I'm coordinating a project titled Colonial Normativity, Corruption and Difference in the Netherlands-Indonesian Relationship from the late 19th century up until the beginning of the 21st century. In this project, we look at the relationship between colonial and political history, and also about in what way did the colonial rule of Indonesia result in a legacy of corruption. Because if you look at lists from the World Bank or from Transparency International, it becomes apparent that many former colonies are at the lowest, ranked at the bottom of these indices of good governance and corruption. So they are the most corrupt, seen as the most corrupt, and former colonial rulers as the least corrupt. But it's strange that this projection is also, according to us, strange, because there was a long historical relationship between, in this case, the Netherlands and Indonesia. So why is that not reflected in these kind of rankings? That's what the project is about. I also participate in various international scholarly networks, including one on politics and corruption, history, social sciences. So much of what I will be saying is based on what I have written at different places and in different books that I have co-authored. But in this lecture, I've structured them in a new way, so to say. Okay, the first topic concerns the rise of what has been called the new corruption history and how it is related to political history. What's new about it? I think one of the, if you look at the older historiography, the, let's say, histories that cover corruption that of before the 1990s, before 2000, there is little reflection on the concept of corruption. So there are, of course, books on corruption and articles on corruption scandals, but there is little reflection on what is actually corruption, what the many many aspects that are involved when you talk about corruption. The new corruption history that started after 2000, when my project in the Netherlands, but also projects in Germany, in France, in England, in some other countries started. There is a lot of reflection on the concept of corruption, on the change of meaning, on the importance of the social political context, the political use of corruption, and the use of corruption for political reasons as a weapon to attack opponents, to undermine their legitimacy. So that's new about the new corruption history. It's also embedded in political history that itself was informed by the cultural turn more recently. So there's much emphasis on the construction of what is considered a legitimate politics and government, or what is considered corrupt politics and good governance. It also incorporates the classical tradition of corruption, by which I mean that the classical tradition is that corruption is understood as the deviation of the pure and ideal form of government, of something that was first pure, good, whole, and corruption is then the deviation of that ideal. This is the classical understanding of corruption. That is incorporated in the new corruption history that when we are researching that. And finally, corruption, according to the new corruption history, offers a perfect entrance to study politics and the history of politics. So what is considered legitimate and illegitimate use of offices, of power, of public and general resources, but also what are considered acceptable and legitimate ideas and what are seen as immoral ideas and practices. And that all related to the specific political context. This brings me to my second reflection, the long-term perspective, that also characterizes the current research on corruption. It takes a long-term perspective. Even scholars of modern history, and so historians that research, let's say, history after 1800, which is more or less, at least in Europe, seen as the start of modern history, the end of the Ancien Regime in France, in the Netherlands, in other countries, the French Revolution, and from there on, modern history starts. But even historians that focus on the 19th, 20th, and early 21st century take into account the longer history. So they take a long-term perspective in order to analyze what's specific for their more recent period. Debates on corruption and anti-corruption indeed date back to classical times, as can be derived from the work of Greek thinkers such as Aristotle and Roman thinkers such as Cicero, whose work was rediscovered as a source of inspiration in the late medieval and early modern period by Republican thinkers such as Machiavelli. These authors, so Machiavelli also, but also the original thinkers he based his work on, were, when debating corruption, they condemned bribery of magistrates and misuses of public office by rulers. Hence, corruption was something negative. That's what we learn from their work. This is how they understand corruption. And they also linked examples of immoral individual misbehavior to the overall moral decay of an entire society and the degeneration of a political system. So up until today, examples of this classical understanding can be found. So when we analyze also contemporary corruption debates and scandals, we can still see links to this classical understanding. So when individual misbehavior is seen as the example of a corrupt system, of an entire system that is degenerating. However, the early modern understanding of corruption was also characterized by the existence of ideas that were more dominant then than they are today. So things have changed. Firstly, what is less prominent nowadays is the idea that corruption was the result of the loss of virtue or moral dedication to serve the res publica, or the general interest. In other words, individuals and communities, at least in the early modern understanding, that were too eager to pursue their private interests on behalf of the general interests, they were lambasted for corruption. Secondly, in the early modern period, also distinctive from what we see in modern history and even in contemporary times, it was characterized by a cyclical understanding of corruption. It was humans' destiny that individuals and societies, after a period of growth, would degenerate and pervert into a rotten form, such as a monarchy that protected the general well-being into a tyranny that protected only the interest of the tyrant and his allies. That was a corrupt form of government. Or an aristocracy, which was considered in classical politics seen as a form of good government, serving the republic's interest, turning into a bad, corrupt form in the name, which is called an oligarchy. An oligarchy is ruled by a self-interested elite. In such a view, anti-corruption was a shared moral responsibility of citizens and politicians dedicated to the well-being of their society. So they had to have virtue and respect the res publica, or the general interest. They had to be humble and virtuous and be alert to signs of degeneration and corruption and to take the appropriate measures to prevent further perversion. That was the more traditional understanding of anti-corruption. The understanding of corruption did substantially change. So now we get to the modern understanding of corruption. It changed during the long 19th century. So let's say from the end of the 18th century, during the 19th century, up until the beginning of the 20th century. This period has also been termed by Bailey the birth of the modern world. And this change was the result of ideological changes, or change of political ideas, and political reform brought by the Enlightenment, or the so-called Atlantic revolutions of around 1800, and the reactions that these reforms provoked. Corruption, and that is interesting, played a pivotal role in public discourse in this period of around 1800. In the era of revolution and reform, in many Western countries, politicians rose to power on an anti-corruption agenda. The French radical revolutionary leader, Robespierre, was nicknamed the Incorruptible and confident to eliminate all perverted ideas and corrupt practices. And although Robespierre, the revolutionary leader, would be executed, and his ideas were often deemed too radical, The 19th century saw many politicians seeking power by making use of anti-corruption campaigns against examples of what they called corrupt ancien regimes. So the ancien regime became a synonym for a corrupt system. Not only the French ancien regime, but also in other countries. Moreover, applauding the skills and merits of the individual in this period had its consequences too. The best should rule, and not those who received their position because of family background or traditional privilege, as was the case in the early modern feudalistic system. In line with the rise of liberalism in the 19th century, the promotion of self-interest was no longer unvirtuous, but something natural and a form of anti-corruption itself. So now the promotion of self-interest was a form of anti-corruption. Because in a world of free trade and laissez-faire that gave room to private entrepreneurship to promote your self-interest, individuals would and could pursue their own interest, and this would, by the famous invisible hand, contribute to overall well-being and not to corruption. That was the new understanding. In the same tradition, tariffs, protectionism, and government-controlled trade monopolies became figureheads of corruption. So I now will take the Dutch example. So the Dutch revolutionaries of around 1800, to take this example, attacked the Dutch stadtholder of the House of Orange and his ruling representatives for their privileges, their system of patronage to divide among themselves and their families administrative positions, and to allow for tax farming and the sale of offices that were common before 1800 but were dissolved after 1800, the sale of offices. Moreover, the Dutch revolutionaries, like in England and in France, demanded the termination of state-supported trade monopolies, such as the famous Dutch East India Company, the VOC, that was terminated in that same period. The critique was combined with pleas for a radical democratic change of society and political structures. Hence, in 1795, in the Netherlands, with French revolutionary support, the old Dutch Republic was overthrown and replaced by a new republic. And the stadtholder, kind of king of the Netherlands, fled to England. The VOC was terminated and the new democratic constitution was adopted in 1798. And this constitution strengthened the centrality of power, abolished elite privileges, including the sale of offices, and sharpened the separation of the public and the private. And the public and the private also in the sense of politics, that was public, and religion, that had to become private, or state and economy, as a mean to end corruption. This was seen and understood at that time as a way to eliminate corruption, separating public and private. This republic proved unstable and was replaced first by a French satellite and after Napoleon's defeat in 1813-1815 by the new Kingdom of the Netherlands. But throughout the 1830s and 1840s, like elsewhere in Europe, reform-minded politicians kept asking for change, which some of them were able to realize during the revolutionary years of around 1848, which is another year of revolution also outside Europe. In 1848, the leader of the Dutch liberals, of the reformers, Johan Thorbecke, you can see him here on the slide, wrote and implemented a new constitution in the Netherlands. And clearly he had studied the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution when he argued that, and I'm quoting him, the French turnover was especially a struggle against the system to keep public rights in private ownership, end of quote. And he also criticized the former king for mixing up the public and the private, or in the words of Thorbecke, the state had at one time been compared with a family. The former king took that serious. At the head of the country of his fathers seemed to have taken this comparison seriously. One left to him the government as if it were his private household. End of quote. So what can we learn from this example? First, if we zoom out and if we want to understand corruption, first, because elite privileges such as patronage and misuse of public power for private interest were regarded the main types of corruption by now, corruption became predominantly defined as the misuse of public power for private gain. This meant by now that not so much a lack of civic virtue, the classical understanding, or the unlimited promotion of one's private interest was the real cause of bad government and corruption, but the merger of the public and the private, the mixing up of public and private tasks, roles, interests. Moreover, for public officials, serving the public interest became an absolute requirement. No longer after 1800, at least not as an ideal. I'm not talking about how things worked in historical reality. We know, of course, up until today of examples where this public officials don't only serve the public cause, but as an ideal after 1800, it became an absolute requirement. No longer were public officials legitimately entitled to also serve their party and family interests. And they also always had to make a claim that what they were doing is in the general interest. Additionally, what was considered the public interest became equal to the state interest. Hence, corruption was the misuse of state office or the state's interest for private or particularistic gain. A second major change that occurred was that due to the emphasis on progress since the Enlightenment, so since the end of the 18th century, the belief rose that a radical change of political and legal structures could eliminate systematic corruption once and for all. Hence, this led to the introduction of constitutional frameworks in many countries in Europe and also outside Europe, in which the public and the private were formally separated, as well as specific laws against bribery and the implementation of formal bureaucratic standards that put a ban on gifts, nepotism, and cronyism. Legal measures to allow for more private freedom in the sphere of the economy is to be considered a part of the same development. And third, and that's also very interesting, I think, in the modern era, when we analyze debates about corruption and scandals, but also public intellectuals writing and talking about corruption, we see that serious corruption became no longer understood as something cyclical or unavoidable, something that would always happen, but as an historical phenomenon. It was a thing of the past. Corruption is a thing of the past. That is one of the basic features of the modern understanding. Because there could be done something about corruption. It could be eliminated, but it required a break from the past, from the famous Ancien regime with its patronage, nepotism, and the mixing up of public and private tasks. Throughout the 19th century and even beyond, anti-corruption therefore concentrated on eliminating what was called Ancien regime practices or old corruption. And that is the famous concept used in Britain throughout the 19th century. They were fighting old corruption. Once successfully eliminated, a society would enter the final stage of human development and become a corruption-free modern country. That's also part of the modern understanding. For example, in the Netherlands, to take this case again, in the decades after 1848, in the Netherlands, the reformed constitution was not altered by a counter-revolution, as in some other countries, and Dutch liberals began to perceive and understand 1848 as an historical turning point. Liberal-minded scholars, including historians, contributed greatly now to a narrative of a Netherlands before 1848 and after 1848. And interesting for our topic of today is that the concept of corruption played a crucial role in this historical narrative. For example, the founder of modern professional history writing in the Netherlands, the liberal historian Robert Fruin, who is also called the Dutch Ranke, and Ranke, as you probably know, is the famous German historian, the founder of modern history writing. So this Dutch example, Robert Vijn, paid ample attention to the corrupt practices of the time of the Dutch Republic in his work. His vision on the Dutch past also informed later generations of historians in the Netherlands. In 1913, in a book celebrating the centennial of the Dutch kingdom, the historian Chris de Lintem wrote, referring to Vijn, and I'm quoting him, that because of the liberal reform of 1848, the corruption of past times had vanished. End of quote. And this claim was restated by the famous Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, also famous for his work on medieval history, who argued in 1934 that serious corruption in the Netherlands had become impossible because of a high standard of public honesty, which, according to him, was itself an element of the Dutch burgerlijke civil culture that had reached maturity during the 19th century. So here we see how the Dutch equivalent of what in British historiography is called old corruption, a narrative that presents corruption as a problem of the past which is solvable, had also entered Dutch political history and history writing. And thus it is an example of how corruption in a new form was constructed and understood in the Netherlands. That brings me to another topic, and that is related, and another reflection I would like to share with you. And that is that the modern understanding of corruption went hand in hand with othering. If the past is a foreign country, you all probably have heard of this famous phrase before, and if corruption is a remnant from the past, serious corruption was no longer to be found in the modern Netherlands or in any modern system. Instead, corruption now, according to the dominant narrative, belonged to the world of pre-modern and traditional societies. In short, to the other. Corruption was a feature of the other. At first, in Dutch discourse, the other was, for example, Britain or France, so neighboring countries, but foreign countries, with their histories of electoral corruption and systemic elite privileging. But from the end of the 19th century, whenever corruption was debated in politics or in the press, so-called Eastern empires, the Russian, the Austrian, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire, were seen as examples of corrupt regimes. And sometimes the other was closer at home. In many European countries, scandals and debates on corruption in the 19th and 20th century illustrate that minorities, especially Catholics in dominant Protestant countries, and also Jews, were at best untrustworthy and at worst held direct responsibility for every form of corruption. I'm not saying that that was the case in reality, but it is what you see if you analyze historical discussions in politics and in newspapers and in pamphlets. And finally, another important other were the indigenous cultures and pre-modern practices that persisted in the colonies of European countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. If you analyze debates in the metropoles, so in the Netherlands, in France, in Britain. This othering also reflected and served to maintain unequal economic and political power relations, so it served a political purpose. A new project I just mentioned that I'm coordinating for the next years as well is exactly about this topic. I and other historians at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, together with historians from the University of Yogyakarta in Indonesia, we investigate the history of corruption as a narrative framework to create, maintain, and challenge exclusive power structures in a colonial and post-colonial setting. What we do is we analyze intersecting moments of entanglement, when the two countries are entangled, come together, of around 1900, when we analyze corruption debates in an era of civilizing missions and late colonial state formation. Another subproject concentrates on 1945, the era of independence movements, in which anti-colonial nationalists turned against the corruption of colonialism. A third subproject focuses on the relationship between authoritarian government in Indonesia during the 1970s and 80s, when it was ruled by a dictator, and the conditional norms of development aid at the same time. And the last project is about the post-1990 era of transnational corruption indices of Transparency International, the World Bank, the IMF, with their imbalance in grading between the North and the South, or between former colonizing and former colonized countries. I already talked about it. It's surprising that it are only Western and many of them former colonial rulers that top these rankings, and that many former colonies are at the bottom, and that it's presented as without any relationship. So it's just the result of national politics and national developments. But what about the entanglement? What about the longer imperial history? So that is what we are researching in this project. And if you're interested, so the book Corruption, Colonialism and Empires that I briefly mentioned contains several case studies. A fourth insight of recent historical work is how the modern corruption understanding, which is heavily influenced by European development, went increasingly global. Our Dutch Indonesia project is therefore also a case in point, according to us. And it shows how understandings of corruptions that were developed in the long 19th century continue to dominate into the 20th century and beyond, and also outside the Western world. In the Western Hemisphere, after the Second World War, after 1945, becoming a modern corruption-free state was equal to becoming a liberal democracy with a market economy, at least in the West. And modernization projects were promoted in the world of the academia, of universities, but also of international organizations, and the world of development aid show that quite clearly. These development programs were also based on modernization theories of the 1950s and 1960s that strengthened the tendency to, and I'm quoting Thomas Mergel, a German historian, to think in terms of developmental stages and the assumption that processes of development followed a certain progression which merely allowed for temporary relapse. End of quote. Moreover, modernization theories were also a reaction to the process of decolonization underway at the time. It expected the countries of what was seen the Third World to catch up and become developing countries, i.e. to evolve along the path of European North American modernity. In this sense, they were never merely analytical instruments, so modernization theories and talking about tradition and modernity, but they are also political, and they were also suggestions from political advisors how to rule a country and change a country. In these theories, the concept of corruption played a structuring role. For example, if we look at a 1961 co-authored book on corruption written by a famous Dutch sociologist, Wertheim, also a former colonial civil servant and a professor of Southeast Asia studies, he and his co-author regarded serious corruption in the Western world in 1961 as resolved, and to be found more in the non-European world. And their work was very much inspired by Max Weber's typology, that countries in the West and in Asia, and therefore countries in the West and in Asia, received the label traditional. They were traditional. They were in transition, or they were already modern. So they were traditional, backward, corrupt. They were in the process of transition to becoming more modern, or they were already modern. Wertheim even concluded that already back in the colonial period, Western standards were half-heartedly obeyed in the colony, suggesting a link between the period before and after colonization. And based on the level of corruption and the efforts to overcome this, he portrayed many countries, including the former colony of the Netherlands, Indonesia, as semi-traditional societies that were still in transition. So corruption was an important analytical part of modernization theory. And even more famous than Brass is Samuel Huntington, the famous American sociologist, and he wrote several works on corruption. And a famous work is the book from his work from 1986 on corruption and structural change. And here he argued that, and I'm quoting him, the difference in the level of corruption which may exist between modernized and the politically developed societies of the Atlantic world and those of Latin America, Africa, and Asia in part reflect their differences in political modernization and political development. End of quote. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia still experience corruption, according to this theory, because they were not completely modern yet, as their political and economic system was characterized by protectionism, favoritism, clientelism, and patronage. However, there were signs of change, according to Huntington. In fact, according to Huntington, corruption was, and I'm quoting him, most prevalent during the most intense phase of modernization. End of quote. And part of this modernization theory and this understanding of anti-corruption was that anti-corruption was not explicitly searched for. So in the 1950s and 1960s, there were no global initiatives taken to establish anti-corruption policies. There were development programs in which corruption played an important role as an analytical and ordering concept, but there were no examples of anti-corruption policies. In fact, explicit anti-corruption campaigns even met with skepticism. According to Huntington, and I'm quoting him, a fanatical anti-corruption mentality has ultimate effects similar to those of corruption itself. It undermines the autonomy of politics. End of quote. And this brings me to the fifth topic. Because things would change. What we see is the emergence of anti-corruption as a distinctive theme, especially from the 1990s onwards. But it started already a bit earlier. And there are several reasons for the concept of anti-corruption and as a theme and as a subject to come into existence as well. Since the 1970s, a new series of corruption scandals had broken out in Western countries, with the American Watergate scandal as the most famous one. In 1972, the American Watergate scandals showed the existence of practices in Western government in the most powerful country of the Western world, the US, up to the top level, that were labeled as corruption. It was about misuse of public power for political gain, the covering up of evidence for reasons of party politics, the bribing of politicians, and a lack of transparency to protect President Richard Nixon, the US president at the time, from being prosecuted for corruption. In the wake of the Watergate investigations, it was discovered that many American companies had made illegal payments to public officials. The evolving Lockheed scandal, so a new scandal, of the mid-1970s was a direct result and was about a series of bribes of foreign officials by Lockheed to promote the purchase of their aircrafts. So, what was it about? It turned out after investigations that many high-ranking officials had been bribed in different countries, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Japan, in Italy, and some of them also had to resign. In the Netherlands, for example, Prince Bernhard, the husband of Queen Juliana, had to lay down his official task. He was not only a prince, he was also the Inspector General of the Dutch army. In Japan, Prime Minister Tanaka was arrested and convicted, and in Italy, President Leone had to resign. As a direct response to the Lockheed scandal, to the bribing of foreign officials by this American company, in the United States, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, was founded, an anti-bribery law. It was implemented in 1977, and it criminalized the bribing of foreign officials by US companies and citizens abroad. It's the first global anti-corruption law. As American companies feared the disadvantages of this law for their business, and because they would be prosecuted when bribing officials abroad if they want to arrange a deal, they urged the US government to establish a global level playing field. And with American support, corruption and anti-corruption were put on the agenda of the OECD, so the organization of the strongest Western economies, and also of the United Nations. And in that same time, the UN General Assembly accepted a resolution which called for cooperation against international corruption and bribery in international business transactions. Because new corruption scandals saw light, the subject of corruption stayed on the agenda in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, West German politics was shocked by the so-called Flick affair. A parliamentary investigation showed that, among other issues, party officials of the leading German parties had accepted illegal gifts from this German company, Flick. In the early 1990s, Italy was shocked by the Mani Polluti investigations that revealed how Italian politicians had illegally provided public contracts to entrepreneurs in return for money and power. It was a huge scandal at the time. And outside Europe, one could think of corruption scandals that involve dictators such as Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu in Zaire, Congo, or Suharto in Indonesia. What they had done caused public indignation there, as well as in Western countries, as these leaders had received large sums of Western aid over the years and were considered allies. But they also had stolen a lot of money. So while the scandals kept corruption on the agenda, the end of the Cold War took away an incentive to finance and to silence corruption in these dictatorships. It also gave room for a so-called Washington consensus among influential countries and international organizations about how corruption could be battled and good governance be established. By now, corruption was understood as a form of rent-seeking or misuse of public goods by self-interested individuals who decided their actions on a cost-benefit analysis. Or in other words, the chance to financially gain something against the absence of cost and penalty. And it's not a matter of, like in early modern times, a lack of civic virtue, of morality, but according to this diagnosis, this analysis, opportunities for corruption were created by the denial of the cost-benefit rationale and the self-interested nature of man, which, moreover, to take away opportunities to benefit from state funding, privatization of state bureaucracies monopolizing public goods was needed, and a clearer, stricter anti-corruption laws to combat the extremes, especially anti-bribery laws, were seen as necessary. Finally, in the 1990s, this is another change. Global civil society organizations were founded with a specific purpose to fight corruption. And the most famous and globally influential NGO in this respect is Transparency International, whose lobby activities and its corruption perception index that ranks countries from least to most corrupt contributed to the growing awareness of the problem of corruption in this era. The new activities and consensus promoted the criminalization of a specific type of corruption, bribery. What we see if we analyze what happens in the 1990s is, for example, the UN Declaration Against Corruption and Bribery in International Commercial Transactions. In 1997, the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Officials in International Business Transactions was adopted. The IMF and the World Bank took corruption more seriously as well in this period, and also concentrated much on bribery in international affairs. And several European firms such as Siemens, Daimler and Bosch supported the change, and individual member countries reformed their judicial system too. In Germany, bribery in business transactions was prohibited in 1997. Bribery of foreign officials that had been tax deductible up until 1999 was no longer tax deductible thereafter. So you could not say that bribes were necessary to, for example, to arrange a deal in a country outside Germany, outside Europe. Even companies that had promoted anti-bribery laws were now prosecuted and convicted. Such as Siemens, that had bribed officials and had to pay an $800 million fine in 2008, the highest fine in the history of the FCPA. So it was fined according to American law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Finally, I would like to reflect on what I term the historic turn in the recent history of corruption. And as may be clear by now, with the history of corruption, I mean corruption in the broader sense, including the debate about corruption and what it is, the academic debate, the debate in international organizations, the intellectual debate, which is often informed by scandals and corrupt practices. But it's important to keep in mind that when I talk about the history of corruption, I take a broad understanding. By the 1980s, corruption, patronage, clientelism, bribery, these things that were called corruption, was diagnosed as endemic in many African and Asian countries. Quoting a famous scholar of the time, Jean-François Ménard, "It is corruption which is normal and the absence of corruption which is abnormal," end of quote, in his study on corruption in Africa in 1986. Others concluded that looking back, the optimism of modernization theory of the 1960s and 1970s to resolve corruption through modernization seemed as living in a paradise of trust in Western aid and good government programs. In the 1990s, new awareness for the problem of corruption rose, for example, due to the work of what I already introduced, Transparency International and the World Bank, organizations that were taking corruption more seriously, as well as new approaches to battle corruption were explored, often informed by policy consultants and the work of political scientists active in the field of development studies and political economy. As said, a turn towards good governance took place. This includes a broader approach to how corruption should be curbed, with much emphasis on promoting systematic institutional change. And that is the backbone of the good governance approach. An emphasis on promoting an impartial legal system and the rule of law, free elections and democracy, transparency and accountability in government, and above all, opening up the economy, ending protectionism and promotion of privatization and the liberal free market. In short, what was perceived to be the Western model that was promoted. This focus on the Western model gave rise to a so-called historic turn. By this I mean a new focus in policy circles and among researchers, again mainly non-historians, mainly political scientists, development economists, and not so much historians were involved, on what could be learned from best performing model countries. that list the top of anti-corruption rankings, such as the one from the World Bank and Transparency International. At the top, and you can see one here, this is the one from Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index. At the top, one can find mainly Western countries and especially Northwestern European countries, such as Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK. In a 2002 report written by the social scientists and policy advisors Len Pritchett and Michael Woolcock, at the time working for the World Bank, getting to Denmark, according to many rankings the least corrupt country in the world, was addressed as a policy research question. It was a metaphor. This was soon rephrased as how to get to Denmark, or how to become Denmark, or becoming Denmark by, among others, Francis Fukuyama and Alina Munjo-Pipidi. And this has sparked a series of research into what can be learned from the history of top-performing countries in how they have corruption somewhere in the past, in the modern era. And many of these historical studies and advices into anti-corruption were, however, not written by historians, and are therefore often one-sided and not reflecting the variety and ambiguities of historical reality, and sometimes even anachronistic or teleological, as historical institutions are studied that are emblematic for countries that are today ranked among the least corrupt in the world. But I must say, it helped to put the history of corruption and anti-corruption on the agenda of professional historians too, especially as they also were invited to join collaborative projects. And the anti-corruption project that I already mentioned, financed by the EU, that I and some other historians were involved in, was such a project. And the volume Anti-Corruption in History was the result of it. And in this volume, and this is what historians can contribute to the debate, we show that the so-called road to Denmark does not exist. The history of anti-corruption is marked by a great variety of context-dependent trajectories, policies and changes that were beneficial to controlling corruption, but only from a retrospective viewpoint. The different historical case studies of this volume testify that often anti-corruption was an unintended by-effect of other changes, and that it is hard, if not impossible, to find decisive breakthrough inventions or moments in the history of best-performing countries. Thirdly, we show that the history of countries and cultures with a very corrupt historical image, such as the decadent Roman Empire or the French Ancien Regime or the Dutch Ancien Regime, have a history of implicit and explicit corruption control and anti-corruption campaigns too, that if well researched and well interpreted, can provide fruitful insights for understanding corruption and anti-corruption today too. This brings me to my final slide, and then I still some time to take questions. Let me come to a conclusion. Where do we stand? What are the main overall insights from the new corruption history? First, that understandings of corruption and anti-corruption are the product of the ideological, political, and historical context in which they are developed. This includes that the overall attractiveness and the scientific soundness and political legitimacy of certain anti-corruption campaigns also depends for a part on context. In fact, we cannot statistically prove if the increase or decrease of corruption in a certain period had anything to do with the rise of corruption itself, nor that anti-corruption measures in best-performing countries were the most important tool to effectively curb corruption. Maybe it were other reasons too, or not only maybe. We show examples of things that were not intended to control corruption, but had that effect. In other words, the recent attention towards corruption inside and outside the academia could better be understood as a reconsideration of the soundness, of the legitimacy, the consequences and origins of the modern understanding of corruption, in a response to changing political and economic circumstances on a national and on a global level. Moreover, reconsidering the history of corruption, which includes reconsidering the history of corruption of the ancient, of the medieval and early modern era, shows us the paradoxes and ambiguities of certain political regimes and anti-corruption programs. For the modern period, the introduction of democracy, or liberal market economy, or a Weberian bureaucracy, so that what is often seen as the core of the successful political modernization in Western countries, was also a paradoxical process, was not a straightforward process that only brought progress. To put it differently, it was a history in which certain forms of corruption were eliminated, sure. For example, the sale of offices, tax farming, and as a key idea, that public offices could be legitimately used for private, family, or factional interest. That indeed changed. Then again, it was definitely also a history of new types of corruption, as well as the reoccurrence of past corruption, of so-called past corruption. For example, electoral fraud continues up until today. Bureaucratic corruption, the same. Lobbying with the purpose to serve particularistic interests. The privilege of tax evasion. Many countries are debating that as a problem, as a type of corruption also. The privilege of tax evasion for those who can afford the necessary legal advices. And the misuse of public office by leading officials for family gain, such as heads of states and presidents that are or were recently active in different countries around the world. Therefore, taking the modern narrative for granted, that serious corruption is a problem of the past that was resolved in Western countries and that real corruption is to be found in other places, is a one-sided depiction of historical reality. And further research could benefit, therefore, from the approaches of the new corruption history, but also contribute to it. For example, by concentrating on the history of corruption in other regions than Western Europe, and by taking an entangled and global history perspective with a focus on the connections between different regions with regard to corruption and anti-corruption. Moreover, from the history of corruption, we can learn for current affairs and policy purposes. Like in history, contemporary corruption debates point at conflicts about collective and particularistic use of resources between different groups in society. It's a conflict between more or less the rich and the poor, but also between politicians and citizens, among politicians, and between local and international actors on how what is defined as a public resource can be legitimately used for particularistic reasons. From history, we learn that corruption scandals and debates point at different attitudes towards and different understandings of what is the legitimate use of public resources. So in short, and this is the final sentence, this is a call to you also as students to continue your work and contribute to the new historical research into corruption and anti-corruption, including by reinterpreting established notions and stereotypes, as well as by analyzing corruption and anti-corruption in historical cultures that are less well studied, for example, non-European regions or the medieval world. And like the question of corruption and good government is never to be solved, so is its history never finished. Thank you for your attention. Shall I now directly take a question? Or
Thank you, Ronald. I'm going to pick some questions here from our audience. I think we have 2 questions. Here goes the first one. It's a question from Pedro Paulo. Considering that the late 8th century corruption had a wider meaning than has now, and that it pointed less to the actions of individuals than to the general moral health of the public body, how does the emergence of proto-liberal sensibilities and the values of merit, egalitarianism, neutrality, and impartiality, for instance, contribute to reshape it at that time?
Yeah, that's a very good question, interesting question. I I think so. If I understand it correctly, I think that is exactly what is happening at the time. So there is. I talked briefly about enlightenment, also as a kind of umbrella concept for ideas about progress, about rationality. But of course, you can include more developments, and not all are maybe covered by the Enlightenment. But indeed, there are. You see the rise of different ideas that contribute to a new understanding of corruption, and I think yes, these could be included. I think one of the things is what is most important, what is covered by the rise of corruption, as understood as the misuse of public office for private gain, which is on the one hand a very narrow definition and understanding, and there is a debate if that really covers also among corruption scholars the real essence. But if we understand it broader than only from a narrow perspective, then it covers these ideas as well. That the impartiality of politics, of politicians, that you should use your office for the general well-being, for the interest of the state. And that is an ideal. That is not something that is directly fixed and settled, but it's if you look at scandals and debates about corruption and good government, then you see how this is, in fact constructed. From my own research on the Netherlands and on Western Europe, you see that corruption scandals are exactly about these issues, about egalitarianism, about impartiality, about neutrality. That all give, that all contribute to this new understanding of corruption. I hope that is a way that helps to answer this question. But I would also say yes, this could be researched and included. Yeah.
Okay, now we have a question about China. So prepare your horses. Here we go. It's a question from Pedro Paulo Tominaga. From ancient China to modern China, passing through the Khans and the Soviets, there's a no large number of accusations of corruptions and multiple approaches to it. So I ask, how is this Oriental in questions mark? How is this Oriental question of corruption approached in the current scene of research in the history of corruption?
It's a very good question. And I would also be very curious about to what will be the answer to it. No, it's definitely it's something that could be included, and that perfectly fits into the lines that I've drawn. And but I'm not a specialist on Chinese history. The book is just translated in Chinese, so I'm very curious also what will be the responses by the Anti-Corruption in History book. Just a few weeks ago it came out, the Chinese translation, and I'm in contact with some Chinese historians because I want to know how they look at it from their perspective and taking into account the Chinese history. So I can't answer it, and it should be included. There is one other thing. As you may have seen, what we did so far, and also colleagues in other countries, we include much of our analysis is also an analysis of discourse, of political discourse, and that requires understanding of the culture and the language of specific countries and regions. So therefore, I'm also hesitating to draw lines, but indeed, it could be included. Okay.
I'm afraid I'm being like to take a step outside my jurisdiction, but I suspect, and it's only a suspect, that what Pedro Paulo has in mind is if corruption is a problem similar to that perspective of Eduard Said's Orientalism, like if corruptions can be instrumentalized by Westerns in some kind of a Oriental stereotype.
Yeah, okay, yes, of course, but I think that's right, and in that sense, that what I do know, and maybe others also know of Chinese history and of other imperial cultures and countries, there is a lot of othering, and I wouldn't be surprised if in that same culture corruption would also play a role in this culture. So corruption is a very important principle to structure power relations. And so it is about misuse, or what is understood as a certain moment of misuse, and anti-corruption as a way to battle it. But what the new corruption history points at, it's also very much a political concept, which is used to maintain or to change power relations, economic relations, but also power relations between countries. And in that sense, it perfectly fits that analysis. Yeah.
Okay. So, Ronald, I would like to thank you very much for this comprehensive lecture. It's like listening to you, it's like making endless notations about insightful points to think about later. It's awesome. That's honest, okay? Filó, acho que te passo agora para você encerrar.
Okay, Professor Kroeze, thank you very much for this excellent conference, that allowed us to understand in a complex way the different aspects that from a historical perspective demand, of course, our reflection as researchers and as citizens also. So we close the session of this inspiring conference by renewing our thanks to Professor Kroeze, and we hope that in the near future, when sanitary conditions allow, it will be possible to invite you to come to Brazil and to continue to discuss with us the problem of corruption. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well for this opportunity to present my view. Thank you. Ok.
Perfeito. É isso, pessoal. Para toda a nossa audiência que está aí, eu agradeço a todos vocês. Vou aproveitar aqui para fazermos um rápido lembrete de que nós temos mais uma mesa de comunicação começando agora às 16 horas, intitulada Análise de Discurso, Léxico e Campos Semânticos, que será coordenada pelo professor Renato Viana Boy, da Universidade Federal da Fronteira Sul. Obrigado a todos que nos acompanharam até aqui por esse período e até daqui a pouco.